Judge insults Jasmine Crockett in court. Shocking moment, he's publicly arrested and handcuffed. Jasmine Crockett walked into the courtroom like she was walking into a storm she already knew was rigged against her. There was no applause, no welcome, not even a nod of respect from the bench. Only a chill in the air that wrapped around her like a noose. The mahogany walls, polished to a shine, seemed to absorb the sound of her heels clicking across the floor. Reporters looked up lazily from their notepads. The gallery was sparsely filled, yet she felt like every seat was occupied by a ghost of silence, waiting to see her fail. At the prosecution table, she set down her briefcase and adjusted her blazer with quiet precision. She hadn't said a word yet. She hadn't opened a file, but from the bench, the voice of Judge Howard Gates cracked across the air like a whip dipped in poison. "Well, well," Gates drawled, leaning back in his chair. "If it isn't Miss Crockett, I hope today's performance is shorter than your last one. Some of us have real cases to hear." The insult came not like a jab, but a public sentence, slow, measured, and designed to humiliate. A few soft chuckles rippled through the defense bench. Jasmine didn't flinch. She met the judge's gaze with the quiet defiance of someone who had long accepted that justice rarely came without a fight. Gates smirked. "I assume you're here to dazzle us with paperwork and progressive buzzwords." Again. He didn't look at the docket. He didn't glance at her materials. He just let the words hang like smoke, curling in the silence. "Remind me, how many of your crusades have actually amounted to anything? One? Half?" Across the aisle, Charles Lawson relaxed in his seat, utterly at ease. His attorney whispered something into his ear, and Lawson let out a small, smug laugh. They weren't worried. Why should they be? The referee had already picked a side. Jasmine turned slightly toward the bench, her expression composed but her posture tight as wire. She opened her mouth, but Gates raised his hand. Not in permission, but dismissal. "Let me save you the trouble," he said. "You're going to tell us about taxpayer dollars. You're going to paint a villain, and then you're going to waste my time with half-baked outrage disguised as prosecution." He rested his chin on one hand and waved the other lazily toward the gallery. "Honestly, Miss Crockett, if I wanted theatrics, I'd watch late-night TV." The court stenographer paused, unsure whether to type that last line. A bailiff coughed awkwardly. The jurors didn't meet her eyes. Jasmine's presence in the room was being chipped away before she could even speak a full sentence. The authority of her role, the gravity of the case, meant nothing here. Not in this courtroom, not under Gates. "Do you even understand what burden of proof means?" Gates added, voice now dipping into condescension. "Or are you hoping sheer passion will substitute for facts this time?" The words weren't just dismissive, they were meant to degrade. He wasn't engaging in legal scrutiny, he was indulging in character assassination, cloaked in judicial robes. Jasmine held her position, unmoved, but something deeper stirred beneath the surface. She scanned the faces in the room, not for support, but for signs of life. She found none, just silence, discomfort, and complicity. She was alone, utterly and absolutely. But she was used to that, and that, more than anything, frightened the people who built courtrooms like this. People like Gates, because they didn't know what to do with someone who stood their ground even as the floor was pulled out from under them. But still, his voice came again. "I suggest you keep today's speech brief, Miss Crockett. The court's patience is thin, and frankly, so is mine." And with that, he looked away, not as a judge ending a statement, but as a king dismissing a nuisance. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. Jasmine didn't move. Not yet. Not until she was ready. And when she finally did speak, it would not be with fire. It would be with precision. Because they hadn't seen the last of her. They'd only seen the beginning of how far they were willing to go to keep her silent, and how far she would go to speak. Jasmine Crockett advanced to the screen, her fingers moving with precision as she clicked through the slides. The numbers appeared in bold. Official city budgets, line items, wire transfer receipts, cold, hard data that painted a damning picture. "Here," she began, voice calm but firm, "is the original budget approved for the Harborfront Revitalization Project. $6 million. However, as you can see from these transfer logs, The amount funneled into Barrington Industries accounts totals more than 18 million. She turned slightly, facing the judge, her tone unwavering. That's over 3 times the allocated funding. The documents supporting these figures were subpoenaed directly from the city's financial archives and cross-referenced with the defendant's internal ledgers. She took a step back, letting the weight of the evidence settle into the room. For a moment, the silence was almost respectful. Almost. Then came the voice from the bench, laced with disdain and boredom. "Miss Crockett," Judge Gates sighed, leaning forward with a smirk, "you're not seriously expecting this courtroom to gasp at a few inflated numbers, are you?" He picked up a pen, spun it between his fingers, and glanced at the gallery as if searching for an audience to share his amusement. "This courtroom has seen its fair share of political theater, but I must say you've brought a fresh spin on an old routine. Dramatic slideshows, financial acrobatics. What's next? A monologue about truth and justice?" A few quiet laughs echoed from the defense side. Gates chuckled lowly. "Let's be honest. These numbers, they're a distraction, a smokescreen. No one in here is losing sleep over decimal points and accounting tricks." Jasmine didn't blink. "Your Honor," she began, keeping her voice level, "under Title 18, Section 666 of the Federal Code, misappropriation of public funds in excess of $5,000 constitutes a criminal offense. We're not discussing decimal points. We're discussing criminal liability." But Gates waved his hand dismissively, cutting her off before the sentence could land. "Oh, please, don't quote statutes at me like I'm a first-year law student. I've been sitting on this bench longer than you've been in this profession, Miss Crockett. Spare us the courtroom lecture." He leaned back, arms crossed, lips curled. "And let's not pretend your stack of documents somehow compensates for the weakness of your argument. All those folders you've lugged in, it's like watching someone try to build a castle out of sand, with extra footnotes." The room grew colder. Jasmine could feel it, not just hostility, but the slow, deliberate erosion of her voice. This wasn't about the case. It wasn't about justice. This was about power. It was about control. She looked at the jury. Some eyes were cast down. Others were wide but vacant, unsure of what they were witnessing or if they were even allowed to question it. Gates's words had weight not because they were true, but because they were law in that moment. No one corrected him. No one dared. And that was the point. She took another breath, grounding herself. "The volume of documentation is necessary, Your Honor, to show a consistent pattern over a span of 3 fiscal quarters. This isn't an isolated mistake. It's a structured, deliberate redirection of funds from public projects into private gain." But Gates had already stopped listening. He turned to the court reporter and muttered something under his breath, then looked back at Jasmine with theatrical exhaustion. "Miss Crockett, you may enjoy the sound of your own voice, but the rest of us have lives to return to." He tapped his gavel once, not in conclusion, but in mock punctuation. "You're beginning to confuse obsession with relevance. And to be frank, I don't appreciate having my time wasted by ambition dressed up as law." The defense table was grinning now. Lawson leaned back in his chair like he was watching a show written just for him. His lawyer crossed his legs, one hand over his mouth to hide the growing smirk. Jasmine, meanwhile, stood in the eye of a storm no one else could feel. One of bias, institutional cruelty, and precision-targeted humiliation. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, but her face remained expressionless. She refused to give them more satisfaction. She refused to fold. But the isolation was complete. Her team behind her sat still, silent, unsure if speaking would help or simply drag them into the same fire. And yet she didn't sit down. Not yet. Because doing so would mean conceding that evidence didn't matter here. That power spoke louder than proof. That smirks and glares carried more authority than numbers, signatures, or law. She stood unmoving, her binder still open in front of her, its pages filled with facts that no one wanted to hear. And for the first time in the entire trial, Jasmine understood the full weight of what she was up against. Not just a corrupt developer, not just a hostile judge, but a system that had no room for truth unless it was spoken by the right people, in the right tone, from the right side of the courtroom. She was none of those things, but she was still standing. Jasmine turned another page in the binder, her voice unwavering, precise. The discrepancy in funding allocations begins in the fourth quarter of 2022. The transactions were signed off not only by senior executives, but also by the former head of internal finance, Raymond Bell. The moment the name left her lips, a ripple of stillness spread across the room like a shockwave. It wasn't visible to most, but Jasmine caught it instantly. The slight shift in posture, the subtle flicker of reaction on Judge Gates's face. His hand, mid-scribble, froze for just a breath. His jaw tensed. His eyes, previously glazed with arrogance, narrowed like the light had suddenly changed direction. It lasted no more than a second. But for someone trained to read faces, it was loud. She had touched something raw, something buried, and in that instant, she knew Raymond Bell was more than a name on paper. He was a key, and Gates knew it. The judge didn't speak right away. He shifted in his chair, clearing his throat with exaggerated control. Then casually, too casually, he reached for his gavel and tapped it once. Not out of order, but as a signal. "Miss Crockett," he said, his voice unusually even, "approach the bench." The request was not optional, and everyone in the room felt it. Jasmine straightened her blazer, her heels clicking softly against the courtroom floor as she stepped forward. The gallery fell silent. Even Lawson stopped smirking. When she reached the bench, Gates didn't look at her immediately. He leaned forward slightly, bringing his voice down to a whisper meant for her ears alone. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was laced with something cold and corrosive. "Some battles," he said slowly, "aren't meant for the faint of heart." Jasmine didn't flinch, but the air between them turned sharp. His words weren't a suggestion. They were a threat. Jasmine walked back to the prosecution table with the weight of the judge's whisper still clinging to her ears like frost. Her heels struck the floor in perfect rhythm, but her thoughts ran uneven. Judge Gates's voice replaying like a looping warning. Some battles aren't meant for the faint of heart. She didn't flinch, didn't stumble, but something about the silence in the courtroom felt off now. Too still, too aware. As she adjusted the files on the table, her instinct pulled her eyes toward the gallery, not in search of anything in particular, but out of that quiet sixth sense that told her someone was watching. And someone was. Back row, far left. A man in a plain gray coat, head slightly bowed, but his eyes were locked on her like he'd been waiting years for this exact moment. Her breath caught, her body stilled. She knew that face. Older now, leaner, more shadow than flesh. But it was him, Raymond Bell, the ghost, the man who vanished 3 years ago after blowing the whistle on Barrington's fraudulent contracts. The man whose name had become a cautionary tale whispered in legal circles and press rooms alike. He had tried to speak once. Then he disappeared. No trial, no headlines, no farewell. And yet here he was, sitting calmly in the shadows of a courtroom where his name had just been resurrected. Jasmine didn't know if he had come for her or to warn her. Raymond didn't blink. He didn't move. He just looked at her, through her, like someone staring at the final page of a story he already knew the ending to. His expression wasn't fear or pity. It was something far colder. Resignation, a quiet message carved into his gaze. You've stepped into something bigger than you realize. Jasmine felt the chill crawl up her arms like smoke from a fire she hadn't seen yet. She didn't look away, and neither did he. There were no words between them, just a long, loaded silence that spoke volumes. She wanted to rise, to call his name, to ask how he survived, where he had gone, what he had seen. But she didn't move. She couldn't, because something about the way he looked at her said, "Don't draw attention. They're already watching." Then with slow and deliberate movement, Raymond stood. He didn't look left or right, didn't nod, didn't gesture. He simply walked out of the courtroom like a shadow fading into fog. No one called after him, no one tried to stop him, and no one even seemed to notice he'd been there at all. But Jasmine noticed. And the moment he passed through the exit door, the room changed. It was like someone had opened a window to winter. The temperature dropped. The lights suddenly felt too bright, the ceiling too low. Even the air had weight, like it didn't want to be breathed. It wasn't fear exactly. It was consequence. It was the presence of a truth so heavy, no one dared name it out loud. Jasmine sat, her hands resting on the files, but her mind miles away. She had just made eye contact with a man who'd lost everything for trying to do what she was doing now. And unlike her, he hadn't had cameras, or a support team, or even a voice loud enough to echo past a headline. They had erased him, and now he had returned, not to fight, but to remind. And if she wasn't careful, she would be next. The system wasn't broken. It was perfectly engineered to make people like Raymond and her disappear quietly. But this time someone was watching, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't ready to vanish. Not yet. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not after the judge's threats, not after the smug grins from the defense table, and not after seeing Raymond Bell vanish into the shadows. She wasn't built to retreat. She leaned forward, her voice level, her fingers tight around the final folder. One she hadn't planned to reveal this early. But the rules of this game had changed the moment the system started showing its cracks. She opened it slowly, deliberately, as if placing a dagger on the table. "Your Honor," she said, her words slicing through the stillness. "This is a signed authorization for a wire transfer dated July 14th of last year. The amount, $2.4 million. The recipient, Lawson's shell subsidiary, Tetra Pacific Holdings." She turned the document to face the courtroom. "And the authorizing signature belongs to you." The room didn't breathe. Not for a second. Even the court reporter froze, unsure whether to keep typing or lift her head. The judge's name echoed like a loaded gunshot in a room full of gas. Gates's face hardened instantly, his skin flushing, his jaw tight. "That's enough," he said, his voice trembling, not with fear but fury. Jasmine continued unshaken. "The signature has been verified by a third-party forensic analyst and cross-referenced against prior court filings. This is not a fabrication." She projected the scanned copy onto the courtroom screen, zooming in on the distinct loops and slants of the pen stroke. "This signature authorized the transfer of public development funds into a private account linked directly to the defendant. There is no ambiguity here." Gates slammed his gavel down like he was trying to crush something beneath it. "This is outrageous," he barked. "This document is inadmissible." His voice had risen an octave, cracking in places where it was usually smooth and controlled. "It was improperly obtained, illegally sourced. This court will not recognize it." The shock rolled across the room like thunder. A man in the gallery muttered, "Did he just say his own signature is inadmissible?" Another whispered, "Why is he yelling?" The jury looked stunned, confused. And in that confusion, Jasmine saw something more important than outrage: doubt. She kept her tone measured. "Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed through official channels as part of the financial disclosure process. Its source is legal, its contents are clear." She stepped closer to the bench, not out of aggression, but precision. Dismissing it without review is a violation of both due process and the public's right to a fair trial. Gates stood now, his face a mask of indignant rage. "Sit down, Miss Crockett. I said it's inadmissible. That decision is final." The silence that followed wasn't compliance. It was tension, coiled so tight it could snap with a whisper. People were no longer just watching a trial. They were watching a reckoning. Jasmine didn't sit. Her eyes scanned the courtroom. The reporters, pens now scribbling furiously. The jurors, some leaning forward. The defense attorney no longer smirking. And Lawson, his mask of calm had cracked. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, his eyes darting toward the judge. Jasmine turned her gaze back to Gates, her voice lower now but sharper. "You're not rejecting the evidence because it's invalid. You're rejecting it because it names you." That landed like a grenade tossed into sacred ground. Someone gasped. Another person stood up in the back, only to be pulled down by a bailiff. Jasmine's words didn't echo. They rang. Gates's fist slammed the bench. "Enough!" he thundered. "This hearing is dangerously close to contempt." His face was red, his composure shredded. "I will not allow this courtroom to become a circus." But it already had. Not because of Jasmine, because of him. because in trying so hard to bury the truth, he had just confirmed it lived inside him. The murmurs turned into low conversations. The gallery was no longer neutral. Something had changed. Power had shifted, and Jasmine knew it. She let the silence stretch before she spoke again. With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe the circus began the moment this court started protecting the accused instead of the evidence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words weren't fire. They were ice, and they cut deeper because of it. She turned to the jury. You've seen the documents. You've heard the denials, and now you've witnessed what happens when the truth gets too close to power. She looked back at Gates. Do what you must, but know this. Every person in this room saw what just happened. The gavel slammed down like a guillotine, sharp and final. This document is inadmissible, Judge Gates barked, his voice no longer controlled but seething with barely veiled rage. And this courtroom will not be hijacked by baseless distractions. His eyes locked onto Jasmine like a warning shot before he turned abruptly to the gallery. 15-minute recess, he snapped coldly, and the words echoed like steel doors slamming shut. He didn't wait for objection or reaction. He simply rose and vanished through the rear chamber, like a man escaping something behind him. A ripple of discomfort moved through the courtroom, like the collective realization that something had gone very wrong. Jasmine stood still for a moment, watching the door close behind him, then quietly gathered her things as murmurs and uneasy glances filled the space he had left behind. She walked quickly through the corridors, heels tapping like a metronome counting down. No one stopped her. No one dared. Her mind was a storm, anger, suspicion, calculation, but her face was a mask. Inside the prosecution's private room, she shut the door behind her and let out the breath she'd been holding since the gavel struck. The silence hit like a punch to the chest. No audience, no judge, no pressure. Just her, four walls, and the growing sense that she was no longer just trying a case. She was standing on the edge of something deeper. She moved to the table, began sifting through her folders, reviewing documents with mechanical precision. But then she saw it. Something that didn't belong. It was wedged between her witness index and evidence log. A beige envelope, plain and unmarked. No seal, no court insignia, no handwriting on the outside. Jasmine froze. She hadn't placed it there. No one on her team had touched these folders since they left her briefcase. Her breath tightened. She reached for it slowly, heart thudding as if she were defusing a bomb. The paper was heavier than standard court stock, like it had been passed hand to hand, not printed from a machine. She opened the flap and pulled out a single sheet, folded twice, the handwriting crisp, deliberate, unmistakably human. Vault B17, Courthouse Archives, basement level. Code 491726. If you still believe in the truth, open it. R.B. Jasmine's hand trembled slightly as she held the note. She stared at the initials. R.B. There was no doubt in her mind. Raymond Bell, the man who had become a whisper, the man who had once tried to do what she was doing now, and paid for it with his silence. Her throat tightened. The room suddenly felt colder, the fluorescent lights too harsh. She sat down slowly, the note resting in her lap like a message from the dead. How had it gotten here? When? She had been watched. No other explanation. Someone had slipped it in, right under the nose of the system that was trying to suffocate her. Someone wanted her to keep digging, and someone had just handed her a shovel. She looked at the note again, absorbing every word like scripture. A vault in the basement, a code. This wasn't rumor. This was a direct invitation, a risk, a warning, and a promise. The room felt like it was shrinking. The clock on the wall ticked loudly now. 12 minutes left in recess. She could wait. She could return to the courtroom, follow the script, let the trial grind forward inch by inch. Or she could move, right now, into the unknown, into the space where the truth was no longer speculation, but something buried beneath concrete and keypads. She stood. Her body moved before her mind had finished weighing the odds, because something inside her already knew. Whatever was behind Vault B-17 was not just evidence, it was everything. Absolutely. Below is a 700-word cinematic narrative written entirely in English, focused precisely on the moment Jasmine accesses Vault B-17 and discovers the damning contents. The tone remains intense and emotionally charged, with immersive detail and the feeling of a thriller unfolding, beat by beat. The basement air was colder than she expected, stale, still, and heavy with secrets. Jasmine moved quickly through the corridor, her footsteps light but purposeful, every sense heightened like she was walking into enemy territory. The hum of distant ventilation echoed off concrete walls as she scanned each vault number until she found it. B-17, unmarked, unassuming, but pulsing with invisible weight. She reached into her blazer, pulled out the folded note, and stared once more at the code written in that steady hand. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, hesitating only for a breath before she entered it. 491726. A soft mechanical click. The lock disengaged. Her heart beat once, hard in her chest. Then she opened the door. Inside was no pile of files. No dramatic evidence strewn in chaos. It was precise, deliberate. A small, black, external hard drive, a sealed envelope, and a thin folder labeled simply, Internal Only, Restricted Access. Jasmine reached in with care, pulling the contents into the dim overhead light. Her fingers gripped the hard drive first, cool and solid, a vessel that felt far heavier than its size. This wasn't backup data or archived financials. This was something built to be hidden, until now. She placed it on the table beside her, then carefully unsealed the envelope. Inside, printed transcripts, screenshots, and email chains. She read just the subject lines and her breath caught. Movement of discretionary funds. Project shielding. From Howard.Gates at statecourt.gov. To Charles.Lawson at barringtongarpy.com. Her eyes scanned faster now, flipping pages, absorbing more than reading. There were emails between Judge Gates and Lawson. Direct coordination, not just bias. Instructions, approvals, cover stories. Dates matched exactly with the suspicious transfers she had tried to present in court. She opened the folder next. Charts, tables, and expense breakdowns. Only they didn't match public records. These were fake budgets, entirely different from the ones submitted to the city. Doctored allocations, hidden totals, names removed. It was fraud carved in ink, and worse, signed off by the very people trusted to prevent it. She picked up the hard drive, hands trembling now. A folded note taped to the bottom. Play clip folder 03, timestamp 2217. The label sent a chill down her spine. Jasmine didn't have time to listen here, but the implication was unmistakable. Audio recordings, the kind that proved everything the emails suggested, and more. Meetings, conversations, voice signatures. Raymond Bell hadn't just collected documents. He had captured the betrayal as it happened, and now he had passed it all to her. A rush of emotion surged through her chest, not just vindication, but grief. Grief for the time lost, the lives ruined, the people crushed under the weight of a system that played God behind courtroom walls. This was never just about Lawson. It was about the rotted root he grew from, and Gates had been watering it for years. Jasmine closed the vault door behind her and tucked the drive and files into her case. The silence of the basement now felt different, no longer just empty, but aware, like it had been watching her this whole time. She checked the time. 3 minutes left in recess. Enough. Just enough. As she hurried back up the stairs, the documents pressed tight against her side. She could feel something shift inside her. Fear was still there, yes, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had turned into fire. She had been mocked, dismissed, isolated in plain sight. They thought they'd buried the truth under arrogance and robes, but they hadn't buried it deep enough, not for someone willing to dig with her bare hands. Jasmine Crockett wasn't walking back into that courtroom to argue anymore. She was walking back with a loaded weapon, made of facts, names, and voices. And this time, the judge wouldn't be the one doing the sentencing. The courtroom doors swung open, and Jasmine Crockett stepped back inside, not as the battered prosecutor they'd tried to bury, but as the keeper of something far more dangerous than theory, the truth. Her walk was steady, controlled, but every step carried the pulse of revolution. The gallery buzzed faintly with whispers that died the moment she crossed the threshold. The jury had returned. The reporters had their pens ready. Gates had resumed his seat, chin slightly lifted, face carved from marble, but his eyes flicked toward her with a tension he couldn't conceal. Jasmine moved to her table, placed a small black recorder gently beside her notes, and for a moment the room felt like it was holding its breath. Then she pressed play. A low, grainy voice filled the room. Male, confident, cold. Make sure the girl never gets her hands on the ledgers. If she does, burn them. I don't care what it takes. The words cracked across the courtroom like lightning. Jasmine didn't say a thing. She didn't look up. She just let the recording play. If she pushes harder, we bury the case. If it gets messy, we bury her too. Under procedure. Under silence. A gasp broke from the back row. A juror's pen dropped to the floor. Even the defense team stiffened, eyes flicking toward Gates, who sat motionless, but no longer in control. Jasmine paused the recording. She looked directly at the judge, and for the first time in that trial, he looked away. He wasn't hiding disdain now. He was hiding panic. The courtroom didn't need explanation. They had just heard the voice of conspiracy, the voice of a system weaponized against the very people it claimed to protect. Jasmine's voice was calm when she finally spoke. This audio was recovered during the recess from a secured archive. The voice belongs to a man who has conspired with both the defendant and the bench to obstruct justice. There was no need to name him. Every person in that room knew exactly whose voice had been captured in that moment of quiet violence. Judge Howard Gates, guardian of the law, arbiter of fairness, had just been unmasked as an architect of corruption. The silence was suffocating. Gates opened his mouth, perhaps to object, to deflect, to destroy, but nothing came. Just breathe. Just the sound of his empire cracking under the weight of undeniable truth. Jasmine stood slowly. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, but her voice carried with the precision of a scalpel. Your Honor, what this courtroom just heard is not misinterpretation. It is intent. It is conspiracy. It is you. Gates's lips trembled, barely perceptible, as his eyes darted to the jury, to the gallery, to the bailiff. But there was no refuge in their stares, no rescue, no reverence. Jasmine continued, stepping forward one pace. For days I've presented evidence, ledgers, budgets, signatures, and every piece was ignored, ridiculed, or silenced. Now the court has heard the reason why. Her voice sharpened, every syllable striking like a hammer. The law has not failed here. It was hijacked, and the hijacker is seated on the bench. The tension was electric. The jury leaned forward in unison. Even the stenographer's keys stopped clicking. Gates slammed his gavel once. Just once. A desperate attempt to reclaim control. This is inadmissible. Fabricated. I will not allow this farce to continue, he barked, but it was too late. His voice cracked, lost its edge. The illusion was broken. Jasmine didn't flinch. You don't get to decide that anymore, she said, eyes locked on him like a sword drawn from its sheath. The court has already heard it. The people have already seen you. Every face in the courtroom now turned to him, not as a figure of authority, but as a defendant caught in real time. The room wasn't on his side anymore, and he knew it. The silence in the courtroom was no longer heavy. It was sharp, electric, stretched thin across every breath and heartbeat in the room. All eyes were locked on Jasmine, the woman who had just shattered the illusion of justice with a single recording. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move quickly. She simply lifted her hand and gave a subtle nod, calm, precise, almost ceremonial. The sound of the rear courtroom doors opening cut through the air like a blade. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence sudden and absolute, moving with quiet authority toward the bench. Judge Howard Gates didn't move. His eyes followed them, disbelief flickering beneath the surface of his otherwise rigid expression. Jasmine remained where she was, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her voice was steady, louder now so that the entire courtroom could hear, each word like a gavel strike. "Judge Howard Gates," she said, her tone neither mocking nor vengeful, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and conspiracy." The gallery gasped, a sound that rippled through the walls like wind through glass. Gates blinked once, slowly. For the first time since the trial began, he looked small, not because of the badge or the title he once wore, but because of what he no longer could deny. The officers flanked him without hesitation. "Sir," one of them said, reaching for the cuffs, "please place your hands in front of you." Gates didn't speak. His lips parted slightly, as if words were forming but couldn't find the courage to land. His hands hovered in place, not quite resisting, not quite surrendering. The weight of the moment hung like a final sentence, and when the metal clicked around his wrists, it was deafening. The man who had once ruled from the bench now stood cuffed before it, stripped not just of power, but of illusion. Charles Lawson, seated just feet away, jolted upright, panic overtaking the smug composure he had worn like armor since the first day of trial. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice rising, trembling. "This is political. This is insane." His lawyer reached for him, whispering frantically, but Lawson pushed him away, eyes darting to Gates like a drowning man watching the lifeguard go under. The gallery erupted, not with chaos, but with reaction. Gasps, phones raised, reporters scribbling at lightning speed. The courtroom, once locked in fear, now pulsed with a kind of awakening, a reckoning. Jasmine watched it unfold without a smile, without triumph. Her face was still, composed, but her eyes, those told a different story. They held the fire of every insult swallowed, every truth ignored, every hour spent screaming into the void while the system laughed in her face. Now it wasn't laughing. Now it was bleeding. Gates said nothing as he was led around the bench. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at anyone. His world was crumbling too loudly inside his head to notice anything outside of it. The very laws he had twisted were now snapping back like steel jaws. The judge's seat remained empty, but the power it once symbolized had already shifted. Jasmine took a slow breath, standing tall in the eye of a storm she had refused to let swallow her. Around her the foundation shook. One brick of corruption pulled loose, causing others to fall in sequence. The prosecutor's bench wasn't a place of struggle anymore. It was now ground zero for the collapse of a lie that had ruled unchallenged for too long. Behind her, her team exchanged glances of stunned awe, but Jasmine didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, grounded in the gravity of the moment. A reporter near the front stood halfway, his voice unsteady but clear. "Miss Crockett," he asked, "did you know the recording would lead to this?" Jasmine turned her gaze toward him, her tone soft but unwavering. "I knew the truth would lead somewhere. I just didn't expect the path to be this quiet until it broke." Her words hung in the air, neither celebratory nor bitter, just real. That was her weapon all along, not theatrics, not showmanship, just relentless, undeniable reality, spoken even when no one wanted to hear it. As the courtroom doors closed behind Judge Gates, as the cuffs carried him into history, the room settled into an eerie stillness. No more shouting, no more lies. Just the presence of something rare, justice, unfiltered, raw, unfinished. And at its center stood Jasmine Crockett, not as a victor basking in glory, but as a survivor of a war that had never been meant to be fought fairly. She didn't blink, she didn't move, because she knew this wasn't the end, absolutely. Below is a 1,500-word cinematic narrative, written in English, based on your exact prompt. The scene unfolds just after Judge Gates is arrested and focuses on Lawson panicking and begging for a deal, Jasmine refusing to let him off easy, rejecting the idea of compromise after the court was sold out. Jasmine demanding a full investigation, not only into Lawson, but into everyone who collaborated with Gates. The tone remains taut, intense, and emotionally searing, like a final act in a legal thriller. The doors hadn't even finished closing behind Judge Gates when Charles Lawson stood up like the floor beneath him had vanished. His face, moments ago smug and assured, was now drained of color. His voice cracked before the words fully formed. Wait, he stammered, raising a hand, palm open, like he could push back what had already come crashing down. This is getting out of hand. We, we don't need to take this any further. We can work something out. His lawyer tried to grab his arm to sit him down, but Lawson shook him off like dead weight. Ms. Crockett, let's be reasonable. Jasmine didn't even flinch. She stood steady behind her table, the room still thick with the aftershock of Gates's arrest. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen mid-sentence. Lawson took a step forward, desperation leaking into every word now. I have information, he said quickly. Names, documents, things that would take you years to uncover. Give me immunity, and I'll give you everything. He tried to sound in control, but his voice was rising, unraveling with every breath. I can help you. I can help fix this. Jasmine's expression didn't soften. If anything, it sharpened. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but each word struck like a hammer. You want a deal? She said. After this court was sold from the inside out? She took a step forward, her stare locked on Lawson like a spotlight. After witnesses were silenced, ledgers erased, and justice buried beneath signatures and bribes? She gestured toward the empty judge's bench, now a symbol of betrayal. You want to negotiate when the bench itself was bought? Her tone was flat, cold. You don't deserve a deal. You deserve exposure. Lawson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Jasmine cut through the silence like a blade. This isn't damage control anymore. This is a purge. The room froze. The phrase hung in the air, more than a threat, an intent. Jasmine turned to the clerk. I am submitting a formal motion to the district office. Immediate expansion of this investigation to include every individual, every office, every contract that passed through Judge Gates's hands. She raised her voice now, loud enough for the gallery and press to hear. This conspiracy didn't end with a signature. It was enabled, repeated, protected. Her eyes swept the room. And we're going to find out who protected it. The clerk nodded, stunned. One of the jurors covered her mouth. Reporters had abandoned their notepads in favor of cameras, phones up, and recording. It was no longer just a trial. It was a reckoning. Lawson stood frozen, lips parted like he still expected someone to object, to call for order, to remind the court that deals were possible, that influence still mattered. But no one moved. No one came. Because for the first time, no one was afraid of him anymore. Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. Every decision Judge Gates made is now under review. Every ruling, every motion denied, every case thrown out. If even one of those decisions was influenced by outside interest, we'll expose it. She turned back to Lawson. And anyone who profited from it, anyone who helped protect it, will answer for it, including you. Lawson was shaking now. His lawyer was whispering furiously in his ear, but the man looked dazed, barely hearing a word. Jasmine didn't look away. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't enjoying the sight. She was fulfilling a promise to the system, to the people it failed, and to herself. You used your money to build a wall around the truth, she said, but walls crack, and now that we've seen through one, we're going to tear the rest of them down. She turned toward the gallery, addressing not just those present, but every viewer who would see this moment replayed 1,000 times. This wasn't about one corrupt businessman. It was about a system that let him operate unchecked, a system that needs cleansing, not compromise. The judge's chair stood empty behind her, but Jasmine's presence filled the courtroom. She wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She was the embodiment of what happens when silence is broken with precision, when truth is delivered not in outrage, but with undeniable clarity. She walked back to her table, eyes scanning the courtroom as she passed Lawson. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared, his world collapsing piece by piece around him. The foundation he thought would never crack had turned to dust in less than an hour. Jasmine opened her briefcase, retrieving a secondary file, the one with names, connections, firms, and favors. She didn't wave it around. She simply placed it on the table, in full view. We start with Lawson, she said to her team, her voice level, but we don't stop with him. Her lead investigator nodded. The energy in the room had shifted. No longer a battle for one verdict, but a campaign against an entire machine. The courtroom was no longer just a place for argument. It had become a war room. The clerk received a call from the district office. A second judge would be stepping in to replace Gates. Trial proceedings would resume, this time under the eyes of a public that would no longer settle for closed doors and quiet bribes. Jasmine turned to face the jury. I know what you've witnessed today was more than any of us expected, but it was also necessary, because justice delayed has never meant justice denied. It's only meant justice was hidden, until now. And for the first time, the jury didn't look confused or overwhelmed. They looked ready. In the gallery, a woman who had sat silently for hours began to clap. One clap, then another. It spread, not raucous, not disruptive, but deliberate, like applause at the end of something false and the beginning of something real. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't smile, but her hands tightened just slightly at her sides, anchored by the weight of what had been fought for and what still remained ahead. Outside the courthouse, the world was already stirring, headlines forming, cameras rolling. But inside, the fire had only just started, and Jasmine Crockett, finally truly, was holding the match. And just when the courtroom thought the storm had passed, the door opened, carrying with it the weight of a name long buried but never forgotten. The courtroom was different now, not louder, not brighter, just heavier. The kind of weight that settles when a storm has passed but left the air charged with something unspoken. The judge's bench was now occupied by a newly appointed federal magistrate, one chosen for neutrality, for integrity, anything that didn't resemble the ruin left behind by Howard Gates. The walls still held the echoes of truth finally spoken, of power finally unmasked. But what came next wasn't about one man's fall. It was about the fire he'd nearly buried, and the one man who'd been burned by it before anyone else, Raymond Bell. The door opened quietly. No announcement, no fanfare, just the soft creak of hinges and the low murmur of a room remembering a name it hadn't dared speak in 3 years. Raymond Bell entered with slow, deliberate steps, every inch of him marked by survival. His hair was grayer, his posture heavier, but his eyes were wide open now. The courtroom stilled. Even the cameras adjusted their angle. This wasn't just a witness. This was a man the system had tried to erase, and now he had returned, not in silence, but in strength. Jasmine watched from her seat at the front, her hands folded atop a single folder, her expression unreadable. She had seen Raymond only in passing, in fragments, once through glass, once in shadow. Now he was stepping into the light, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the gravity of it. He was here. He had chosen to return. And he had done it because she hadn't stopped. Raymond raised his hand, was sworn in, and sat. The silence was total. The judge asked him to state his name for the record. He did. Then he paused and spoke. I was the director of financial oversight for Barrington Group, Raymond began, his voice quiet but unwavering. 3 years ago, I submitted a whistleblower report documenting deliberate misappropriation of public development funds. The evidence I provided implicated multiple senior executives, Charles Lawson among them. I submitted my report through the proper legal channels. Within 72 hours, my access was revoked. My office was emptied. I was placed under an internal investigation, and then I vanished. His words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They carried the weight of truth crushed beneath bureaucracy and fear. I was warned, he continued, not formally, not in writing, but through locked doors, through lost files, through the sudden deaths of 2 of my colleagues in the same quarter. The message was clear: run or disappear for good. I chose to run. A gasp broke from the gallery. A juror shifted, visibly disturbed. Raymond didn't flinch. He looked directly at the judge now. I stayed gone because I believed the machine would win, that no one could stand against it. And I was right. Until Jasmine Crockett walked into this courtroom. He turned toward her then, not dramatically but with clarity. I saw what she was doing. I saw the evidence. I saw her pushed down, mocked, isolated, and I remembered. He paused, his voice catching just once before he steeled it again. Justice doesn't vanish. It doesn't die. It just dims. waiting for someone willing to strike the match. He nodded slightly, eyes locked on Jasmine. She reminded me what that match looks like. The room held its breath. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. But her eyes were full, not with tears, but something deeper, quiet gratitude wrapped in fire. Raymond turned back to the judge. I've submitted the documents I kept hidden, contracts, meeting recordings, emails, and digital ledgers that prove Charles Lawson and Howard Gates conspired to funnel state money into private projects while manipulating the court system to silence opposition. I have the proof. I've had it all along. But it took someone braver than me to make it safe to use. The gallery broke its silence with a wave of hushed reactions. A reporter muttered into his recorder. A clerk scribbled furiously. Lawson had gone pale, his head lowered, his shoulders shaking. Not in sorrow, but in rage, in fear, in the realization that no one was coming to save him this time. Jasmine stood slowly as the judge asked if she wished to respond. She approached the bench without notes, without props, without anything but the truth burning in her chest. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and quiet, the testimony we've just heard confirms what this investigation has uncovered layer by layer. That the defendant and his collaborators didn't just steal funds. They stole faith. They used the court like a weapon. They made the truth a threat. She turned to face the jury, then the gallery. But what we've seen today also proves something greater. That even when justice is smothered, it doesn't die. It waits. It waits for someone to refuse silence. It waits for someone to come back. She looked again at Raymond. He nodded once, his face unreadable, but his hands folded with calm. The documents Mr. Bell has submitted will be entered into evidence. They will be reviewed, investigated, and pursued. Not just to convict Charles Lawson, she said, turning her gaze toward the now defeated executive, but to shine light on every dark corner he operated in. Every name, every deal, every blind eye. Her voice hardened slightly. We are not here to punish one man. We are here to undo the lie he built. She returned to her table. The judge dismissed the hearing for the day, announcing that federal prosecutors would be reviewing the expanded evidence immediately. The bailiff called for order, but there was no restoring order to what had just happened. Not really. Something had shifted. Forever. Jasmine gathered her things slowly, the courtroom buzzing behind her in muted disbelief. She stepped outside the chamber doors, the late afternoon sun bleeding in through tall windows. In her hand, she carried the original folder, the one she had fought with, cried over, clung to when everything else told her to walk away. Her suit was slightly wrinkled, her feet ached, her throat dry, but her eyes were steady. A reporter called her name. She didn't turn. Another asked if she had anything to say to the public. She paused just for a breath, then looked straight ahead and answered, not with a speech, not with a smile, but with a single sentence that carried the weight of everything behind it. I didn't win because I had power. I won because I didn't quit. And then she walked forward, past cameras, past questions, past the ghosts of every truth they tried to bury, hand gripping the folder like a torch, gaze set on the fire still ahead. Because Jasmine Crockett knew, the fight for justice never truly ends, but it always begins with someone who refuses to stop. And just like that, Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the courtroom and into the pages of history, not merely as the prosecutor who took down Gates and Lawson, but as a woman who had challenged and dismantled a fortress built upon lies. As the heavy oak doors closed behind her, the muffled voices and flashing cameras blurred into a distant hum. She paused briefly, taking a slow breath that felt as though it had been held since the day the trial began. The weight of victory, hard-fought and almost unimaginable at times, settled softly on her shoulders. But Jasmine didn't smile. Not yet. Her journey wasn't merely one of triumph. It was forged from a storm of isolation, injustice, and betrayal that had nearly broken her. Yet through it all, she had remained standing, not because of power, not because of privilege, but simply because she had refused to surrender. She tightened her grip on the worn file in her hand, the documents she had clung to through the darkest days, now symbols of the truth she had fought so hard to expose. In the days following the trial, Jasmine's name became a synonym for justice restored. Media outlets clamored to tell her story, recounting every tense exchange, every courageous stand against intimidation, and every crushing revelation she had brought to light. Headlines splashed across newspapers and screens nationwide. The woman who broke the silence. A single prosecutor topples an empire. Justice restored. Jasmine Crockett's unyielding battle. Interviews, book deals, and speaking requests flooded her inbox. Yet she accepted few, preferring instead to quietly navigate the aftermath of the seismic legal battle she had ignited. But public fascination could not be contained, and without seeking it, Jasmine found herself thrust into the spotlight, not as a figure of fleeting fame, but as a powerful reminder that justice, even when battered and bruised, was never truly defeated as long as someone dared to fight for it. Yet Jasmine's victory hadn't erased the scars left by the grueling fight against a system so deeply corrupted. She vividly remembered the whispers, the contemptuous glares from Gates, the condescending laughter from Lawson's defense team, all designed to break her. Those memories, once painful, now became her strength. They were reminders of why her story needed to be told, shared, and remembered. She knew firsthand the loneliness of standing alone against immense power, of speaking truths others desperately wanted buried. She had felt the suffocating pressure of injustice firsthand, had seen its chilling effect on lives destroyed without remorse. It wasn't enough to have won. She knew she had to ensure the battle she'd fought wasn't forgotten, that it became a beacon to others who might someday face their own seemingly impossible fight. Months later, Jasmine accepted an invitation to speak at a prominent law school, an event initially planned as a single lecture. As she stepped into the lecture hall for the first time, the room filled beyond capacity, students packed shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, eyes fixed with anticipation. They had read the headlines, studied the transcripts, analyzed her tactics. Now they waited breathlessly to hear from the woman herself. Jasmine stepped onto the podium, standing quietly for a moment, her presence alone speaking volumes. She surveyed the faces of young students, eager, hopeful, determined, and for a brief second, she saw her younger self reflected back, someone who once believed the law would always stand tall on its own. She understood that these students, just like she once had, needed more than theory. They needed the raw truth of her experience, its harshness and beauty, despair and triumph. Justice is not a guarantee, Jasmine began softly, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent auditorium. It's an endless fight, one you must be willing to fight even when no one else believes victory is possible. Her words resonated deeply, each syllable settling heavily on the students. She told them of the intimidation, of the relentless attacks on her character, of the deliberate attempts to isolate and silence her. But then she spoke about the courage she found in the face of that isolation, the strength that emerged precisely because there had been no other choice but to continue fighting. The courtroom, she said clearly, is not just where laws are tested, it's where our courage, our resolve, and our very belief in justice itself are put to trial. After that first lecture, Jasmine quickly became a fixture at the university. Every Thursday she returned to speak, not merely as a lecturer, but as a storyteller whose very presence inspired hope. Students filled her classes eagerly, captivated by her stories not because they were thrilling, but because they were real. Jasmine never sugarcoated the cost of her fight. She revealed openly the toll it took, emotionally, mentally, physically, emphasizing repeatedly that justice was not achieved through comfortable means. But she also reminded them that it was precisely because justice was so fragile and easily compromised that fighting for it mattered so deeply. Over weeks, then months, Jasmine's influence expanded beyond the campus. Universities across the country invited her to speak, to ignite similar fires in future lawyers and advocates. Law professors referenced her trial in classrooms, not simply as an example of legal victory, but as evidence of the resilience required to confront systemic injustice. But despite the demand for her voice elsewhere, Jasmine remained deeply connected to the students she met each week, always choosing to return to the same lecture hall, the place where she first recognized the magnitude of her impact. Soon, Jasmine was no longer just a legal figure or public heroine. She had become an embodiment of what it meant to uphold justice in the face of impossible odds. Students admired not just her victories, but her integrity, her courage under pressure, her unyielding dignity, even when standing entirely alone. More than a few had entered law school driven by idealism, but now they were determined to emulate Jasmine's example, committed not only to defending the law but also to challenging it when necessary, to confronting corruption head-on. Her lectures sparked fiery debates about ethics, responsibility, and the moral imperative to question authority, not out of defiance, but from the duty to ensure justice truly served all, not just those with power. Yet Jasmine remained humble, aware always that she had never sought fame nor power. Her victory wasn't the product of status or influence. Rather, it emerged from stubborn resilience, from a refusal to back down even when defeat seemed certain. She often concluded her lectures by reminding students, "You don't have to be powerful to change the world. You just have to refuse to let the world change you." Those words, quiet yet resonant, became a rallying cry among students who increasingly saw her not merely as a professor, but as a mentor, a guardian of principles they vowed to uphold themselves. One evening after class, a young woman approached Jasmine cautiously. "I want to fight for justice like you did," she said quietly, nervously holding out her hand. Jasmine shook it firmly, smiling gently for perhaps the first time. "Then prepare yourself not for praise but for struggle, for long nights alone, for battles that will feel unwinnable. And know this," Jasmine paused, looking intently into the student's eyes, "the greatest victories are not found in verdicts or headlines, but in the quiet moments you choose to stand firm when every voice around you tells you to stop." The student nodded slowly, visibly strengthened, the torch of Jasmine's fight clearly passing between them. As the lecture hall emptied, Jasmine stood alone for a moment, quietly gathering her belongings. Her fingers traced the edges of the very same file she'd clung to during the trial. The papers inside, once heavy with evidence, now seemed weightless in comparison to the truths she had discovered within herself. She stepped toward the doorway, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty room, a place that had become both refuge and battleground, sanctuary and stage. As she crossed the threshold back into the world, she did so with no illusions about what lay ahead. More battles, more resistance, more uncertainty, but also with unshakable clarity. Jasmine Crockett had not triumphed because she was powerful. She had triumphed precisely because she wasn't, because she had faced injustice armed not with influence, but with resilience, because she understood that the fight for justice was never ending, that every generation must choose to carry it forward. Stepping into the cool night air, Jasmine drew a deep breath, finally allowing herself to smile, not in victory, but in quiet pride, recognizing fully, perhaps for the first time, the power of never giving up. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.